June 11, 1961, 14:45 Eastern Standard Time. National Archives and Records Administration, College Park, Maryland. Amidst the scent of aging paper and floor wax, Dr. Alistair Finch, a senior military historian from Georgetown University, adjusts his spectacles and leans closer. He's carefully examining the freshly declassified OSRD document, Summary Technical Report, Division 4, Volume 1, the Proximity Fuze. As his eyes scan the technical diagrams and casualty statistics from late 1944, a quiet gasp escapes his lips. He's holding the answer to a 17-year-old mystery, a secret weapon that had remained entirely invisible to its victims, a devastating truth hidden in plain sight. The story didn't begin in that quiet archive. It began in the frozen, blood-soaked hell of December 16, 1944. Under the command of General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, a force of over 200,000 German soldiers and 450 tanks of the 6th Panzer Army smashed into a thinly held 83-mile American front in the Ardennes forest. The initial assault was a catastrophe for the Allies, shattering the 28th and 106th Infantry Divisions. A brutal winter storm had grounded the 9th Air Force's two 500 tactical aircraft, leaving the American troops blind and exposed. The air was thick, with the smell of pine, cordite, and freezing diesel exhaust. In his temporary command post, Major General Gladian M. Barnes, a 1910 West Point graduate and chief of Army Ordnance Research, knew that without air support, his men had only one thing to rely on: artillery. And he was holding an ace he hadn't been allowed to play. That ace was born not in the chaos of battle, but in the sterile, humming quiet of a laboratory 2 years earlier. On August 12, 1942, at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory at 8621 Georgia Avenue, Dr. Merle Antony Tuve, a brilliant physicist with a Ph.D. from Johns Hopkins, 1926, watched the results of a live fire test over Chesapeake Bay. His team, Section T, operating on an initial budget of $1.5 million, had done the impossible. They had created a miniature Doppler radar that could survive being fired from a cannon. The project was so secret that the lab, a nondescript brick building with reinforced floors, was guarded 24/7 by U.S. Marines. It was here that Tuve and the brilliant ordnance expert Commander William S. Deke Parsons worked relentlessly to weaponize a scientific miracle. The secret was the Mark 32 model of the VT Proximity Fuze, codenamed Project POZIT. It was a self-contained radio transceiver, no bigger than a milk bottle, packed with 4 delicate vacuum tubes and a thyratron gas-filled switch. The entire assembly was designed to withstand the crushing 20,000 g-forces of acceleration and the dizzying 25,000 revolutions per minute spin inside the barrel of a howitzer. Until this point, General George C. Marshall's orders were absolute. It was to be used only over water against aircraft, to prevent a dud from falling into enemy hands. The secret was deemed too valuable to risk. As the German advance threatened to split the Allied armies in two, that calculation was about to change. At SHAEFG-2, Colonel David Sterling, a pre-war Harvard Law graduate, 1934, now attached to the Counterintelligence Corps, felt the immense weight of his mandate for absolute security. For over 2 years, he had managed a multi-layered disinformation campaign, suggesting American breakthroughs were in meteorological prediction, anything to hide the truth of Project POZIT from German scientists like Professor Rudolf Myhler. But now, with the front collapsing, the most guarded secret of the war was about to be unleashed. Before I tell you how Dr. Merle Tuve and his team at Section T managed to create a firestorm that would halt the German army in its tracks, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Believe me, you won't want to miss the story of the invisible weapon that won the Battle of the Bulge. The brutal winter of 1944 was a character in itself. On December 16th, under the command of General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, the German war machine made its last great gamble. The air in the Ardennes forest, thick with the smell of pine and freezing diesel, crackled with the sound of the 6th Panzer Army's 450 tanks smashing through the thinly held 83-mile American front. For the men of the 28th and 106th Infantry Divisions, it wasn't a battle. It was a deluge of steel and fire they simply couldn't stop. The American predicament was dire. The 9th Air Force, commanded by Lieutenant General Hoyt Vandenberg, had over 500 tactical aircraft, but a crippling winter storm had grounded every last one. On the ground, Major General Troy H. Middleton's 8th Corps was fighting for its life. His artillery batteries, equipped with the reliable M2A 1105 mm howitzer, were firing desperately into the blizzard, but the deep snow acted like a giant pillow. The shells, fitted with standard impact fuzzes, plunged into the drifts with a muffled thump, their explosive power smothered. By December 17, 1944, the calls for effective fire support were reaching a fever pitch. Meanwhile, the German offensive, codenamed Operation Wacht am Rhein, was a spectacle of terrifying efficiency. General der Panzertruppe Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army aimed for the Meuse River, just 60 miles away, a move that would split the Allied forces in two. His spearhead included the formidable Tiger II heavy tanks, their 88 mm KWK-43 guns capable of killing a Sherman tank from over 2,000 meters. The initial assault by over 200,000 soldiers at 5:30 on December 16th had been fueled by ersatz coffee and a desperate renewed belief in victory. The low, guttural rumble of hundreds of engines was the first and only warning the Americans received before the tree line exploded. Back in Washington, D.C., the news hit the Pentagon like a physical blow. By December 17th, Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall, a man known for his stoic calm, understood the gravity of the reports flooding in. This wasn't a feint. This was an all-out offensive. He conferred with General Henry Hap Arnold of the Army Air Forces, who confirmed the weather forecast for the next 7 days was abysmal. Air support was a fantasy. The burden of response would fall to the ground troops and their artillery, and to men like Major General Gladian M. Barnes. Major General Barnes was a different breed of soldier. A 1910 West Point graduate with a master's in mechanical engineering from MIT, he was a man of science and steel, more comfortable with slide rules than battle maps. In his office, the air thick with the scent of old paper and stale pipe tobacco, he had championed the development of the M7 Priest self-propelled artillery for the last 2 years. He knew its 105 mm gun was a masterpiece, but he also knew, from the frantic cables arriving from SHAEF, that its standard ammunition was failing. He'd seen the first successful test reports from Section T back in October 1942, and he knew they were sitting on a miracle. That miracle was being forged in the humming, sterile laboratories of the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. At 8621 Georgia Avenue, Dr. Merle Antony Tuve, a brilliant physicist with a Ph.D. from Johns Hopkins 1926, led the charge. Tuve was a man of restless energy, constantly pacing, his mind a whirlwind of high-voltage physics and complex equations. The lab, established in August 1940, smelled of ozone and hot electronics, its work shielded from prying eyes and ears by reinforced concrete and a 24/7 U.S. Marine Guard. Tuve wasn't just building a FOZ. With his chief deputy, Dr. Lawrence R. Hafstad, and a team of over 100 scientists, he was wrestling with the very laws of physics on a project whose budget would eventually exceed $800 million by 1945. The core challenge seemed impossible. They had to engineer a radio transceiver, complete with 4 delicate glass vacuum tubes and a thyratron gas-filled switch, to survive the 20,000 G-forces of being fired from a cannon. This is where Commander William S. Deke Parsons, a 1922 Naval Academy graduate, became the indispensable bridge. He was the man who had to turn Tuve's fragile lab prototype into a weapon of war that wouldn't disintegrate into 1,000,000 pieces inside the barrel of a 5-inch naval gun. Commander Parsons was the epitome of naval discipline, a striking figure in his crisp khakis amidst the chaos of the workshop. A postgraduate specialist in ordnance engineering, he possessed a quiet, unshakable competence that calmed the anxious scientists and motivated the hardened ordnance crews. It was Parsons who personally oversaw the thousands of test firings at the Naval Proving Ground in Dahlgren, Virginia, throughout 1942 and 1943. The rhythmic tonic boom of the test cannons echoing across Chesapeake Bay was the soundtrack to his relentless pursuit of perfection, insisting on using the new, reinforced shell casings from the Crosley Corporation to give the delicate electronics a fighting chance. Keeping all of this under wraps was the monumental task of Colonel David Sterling of the Counterintelligence Corps. A sharp-witted Harvard Law graduate, 1934, Sterling operated out of Fort Ritchie, Maryland, and was a master of misdirection. He orchestrated a system of extreme compartmentalization. Of the 87 companies manufacturing components, from RCA making the vacuum tubes to Eastman Kodak producing optical elements, not a single one knew the final purpose of their work. Fewer than 500 people in the entire Allied war effort knew the full scope of Project POZIT. Sterling's masterpiece was a disinformation campaign codenamed Operation WWII, launched in early 1943. It was a brilliant piece of psychological warfare designed to mislead German intelligence. He fed fabricated reports through neutral channels in Switzerland, detailing a fictional American breakthrough in meteorological science. The story was that new artillery shells carried advanced sensors to read atmospheric conditions, allowing for more accurate fire. The German Abwehr, under Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, swallowed it whole, sending top scientists like Professor Rudolf Myler on an 18-month wild goose chase to develop competing atmospheric prediction technology. It was a perfect deception. The standard American artillery protocols of the time stood in stark contrast to this hidden sophistication. A forward observer in the Ardennes in December 1944 would spot a target, then spend 3 to 5 precious minutes radioing coordinates back to a fire direction center. There, soldiers would frantically calculate trajectory against the wind and snow, guessing at the timer setting for an airburst. The process was slow, and the initial ranging shots, which often fell short or long, gave away the battery's position to German counter-battery fire from their lethal 88mm guns. This inefficiency was measured in lives. It took an average of 198 conventional 105mm shells to neutralize a single enemy machine gun nest or mortar pit. In the Ardennes, where impact fuzzes were rendered useless by the deep snow, and timed fuzzes were hopelessly inaccurate against the 300-foot-tall trees, American GIs from the 7th Armored and 101st Airborne Divisions were being cut to pieces. They were holding the line with courage, but they were paying an unacceptable price in blood for their artillery's technological shortcomings. The irony was staggering. By December 19, 1944, more than 2.2 million of the revolutionary VT fuzzes were already in Europe, stored in heavily guarded depots in Britain and France. They sat in wooden crates stenciled Special Ammunition Lot T, a designation that meant nothing to the logistics officers handling them. General Marshall's use-only over water order, first issued in June 1943 after the fuse proved its worth against Japanese planes near the Solomon Islands on January 5, 1943, was still in absolute effect. The fear of a dud falling into German hands and being reverse-engineered was considered a risk too great to take, even as the front was collapsing. The German technical intelligence services, for their part, were blissfully ignorant. Their primary research center at Rechtlen-Lars Airfield, under the influence of luminaries like rocketry expert Manfred von Arden, was focused on wonder weapons like jets and missiles. In a captured 1942 report from the Reich Research Council, German scientists had officially concluded that it was physically impossible to build a vacuum tube that could survive the immense G-forces of an artillery shell. This fundamental miscalculation created a blind spot so profound that they simply could not imagine the weapon being aimed at them. And so the stage was set. As the panzers of the Sixth Army chewed up the frozen Belgian countryside on December 18, 1944, their crews were utterly oblivious. They were driving headlong into a meticulously prepared technological ambush. The weapon that would stop them wasn't another tank or plane, but a 5-pound secret packed with miniature radios. A secret Major General Barnes was at that very moment preparing to risk his career on by pleading with General Eisenhower to finally unleash it. The entire audacious enterprise began not with a bang, but with a directive. In August 1940, Dr. Vannevar Bush, head of the National Defense Research Committee, summoned Dr. Merle Tuve to his office. The challenge he laid out seemed to defy the very laws of physics. Build a radio transmitter and receiver small enough to fit in the nose of an artillery shell and rugged enough to survive being fired from a cannon. The air in Tuve's initial workshop at the Carnegie Institution crackled with the hum of high-voltage equipment and the faint scent of ozone, as he and his small team began their work with an initial budget of just $1.5 million. Dr. Merle Antony Tuve, a restless genius with a 1926 Ph.D. from Johns Hopkins, was the perfect man for an impossible job. He established Section T at the new Applied Physics Laboratory at 8621 Georgia Avenue, a nondescript building whose reinforced concrete floors groaned under the weight of experimental machinery. Tuve, a chain smoker who constantly chewed on unlit Chesterfield cigarettes while scrawling complex circuit diagrams on slate blackboards, knew the core problem was the vacuum tube. The standard RCA-made tubes, with delicate tungsten filaments thinner than a human hair, would vaporize under the 500 G-forces of a test centrifuge, let alone the 20,000 gigaseconds of a cannon launch. For over 18 months, from late 1940 to early 1942, every single test ended in failure, the sound of shattering glass a constant, demoralizing refrain in the heavily guarded lab. The breakthrough came from a radical shift in thinking. In early 1942, Tuve and his brilliant deputy, Dr. Lawrence R. Hafstad, abandoned the idea of cushioning the standard tubes. Instead, they would build a new kind of tube from scratch, one designed for violence. Working with engineers from Western Electric and Sylvania, they developed the T3 ruggedized vacuum tube, a marvel of miniature engineering with its components braced by steatite ceramic discs and short, thick filaments. On January 29, 1942, they conducted the first successful drop test from a 110-foot tower, the muffled thud of the device hitting the ground, followed by an electrifyingly positive signal. This laboratory success needed to be weaponized, a task that fell to Commander William S. Deke Parsons, USN, a 1922 Naval Academy graduate and ordnance specialist. Parsons was a figure of immaculate discipline amidst the creative chaos, his crisp khaki uniform, a stark contrast to the scientists' stained lab coats. He established the brutal real-world testing regimen at the Naval Proving Ground in Dahlgren, Virginia, where the air was thick with the smells of salt marsh and cordite. His procedure was methodical: fire hundreds of prototype fuzzes from a 5-inch naval gun into a massive sandbank, then have crews dig them out by hand to analyze the mangled electronics. Throughout the spring of 1942, over 90% of the prototypes failed. It was Parsons who worked directly with the Crosley Corporation to engineer the reinforced Mark 8 steel casing, a design change that, by June 1942, had increased the Fuze's survival rate to a promising 30%. He wouldn't accept anything less than 50% for production. Just as critical was the power source. A conventional battery would be crushed into uselessness on firing. The solution, conceived by a team led by Dr. Richard B. Roberts, was a masterpiece of battlefield engineering. They designed a tiny wet cell battery where the electrolyte was stored in a sealed glass ampule, suspended above the dry battery plates. The immense setback force of the 20,000 G launch would instantly shatter the fragile ampule, releasing the fluid and activating the battery for the shell's flight time of up to 50 seconds. The sharp, acrid scent of spilled acid was a constant in Roberts's corner of the APL throughout July 1942, a byproduct of the thousands of tests required to perfect this crucial component. The moment of truth arrived on a humid, insect-heavy afternoon. At 14:30 Eastern Standard Time on August 12, 1942, Dr. Tuve and Commander Parsons stood on an observation tower overlooking Chesapeake Bay. 3 radio-controlled drone aircraft, Grumman J-2F Ducks, droned overhead. A 5-inch naval gun fired a single shell armed with a live Mark 32 fuzz at the third drone. For 15 agonizing seconds, the shell was a silent speck in the sky. Then, a perfect black puff of smoke appeared approximately 70 feet from the drone's wing. The aircraft, peppered with shrapnel, immediately spiraled into the water. The secret weapon worked. Now they had to build millions of them. This monumental industrial challenge was championed by Major General Gladian M. Barnes of Army Ordnance. A pragmatic engineer with a master's from MIT, Barnes knew a single prototype was a curiosity. Millions were a war winner. He secretly orchestrated a vast, compartmentalized supply chain of 87 different companies. RCA and Sylvania were contracted to produce over 5 million ruggedized vacuum tubes by 1944. The Crosley Corporation, a company famous for making refrigerators, was retooled to manufacture 20 million specialized fuse housings. The final top-secret assembly took place at the purpose-built Naval Ordnance Plant in Indianapolis, NOPI, a 1.2 million square foot facility where over 15,000 workers, most of them women who believed they were assembling new types of radio equipment, worked in 3 shifts around the clock. The project's cost soared from $1.5 million to an eventual price tag of nearly $1 billion. This industrial miracle was protected by a fortress of secrecy, meticulously constructed by Colonel David Sterling of the Counterintelligence Corps. The compartmentalization was absolute. A worker at the Eastman Kodak plant in Rochester, New York, might spend her day grinding tiny glass lenses, believing they were for a new bomb sight. A technician at RCA's Harrison, New Jersey plant would test thousands of T3 vacuum tubes, thinking they were for advanced field radios. The project's name, POZIT, was a code word known to fewer than 500 individuals in the entire Allied command. Documents were moved only by armed courier, and any employee at any of the 87 contractors who asked too many questions was quietly visited by Sterling's agents and often found themselves reassigned to a remote Aleutian weather station for the remainder of the war. At the heart of the fuse was its miniature Doppler radar brain, the circuit, perfected by a young drive. James Van Allen, who would later achieve fame for discovering Earth's radiation belts, contained a tiny oscillator that emitted a continuous radio wave at a frequency between 180 and 220 megahertz. As the shell screamed towards its target, the reflected radio waves returned at a slightly different frequency. Van Allen's 4-tube amplifier circuit was designed to detect this minute frequency shift. When the shift corresponded to a preset distance of 70 feet, it triggered the thyrotron gas-filled switch, firing the shell's main charge in less than 1,000th of a second. By late 1943, the fuzz, designated Mark 32 for naval guns, had proven its devastating effectiveness against Japanese aircraft in the Pacific theater. Yet General George C. Marshall's order forbidding its use over land in Europe remained absolute. Major General Barnes, however, saw its true potential. In at least 3 classified memos to the Joint Chiefs of Staff during the bloody fighting of 1944, he argued that adapting the fuse for the Army's M2A 1,105 mm howitzer could shorten the war. He cited after-action reports from the Italian campaign, where it took an average of 198 conventional shells to neutralize a single German gun emplacement. With POZIT, he estimated it would take fewer than 25. By December 1944, over 2.2 million of these revolutionary fuzzes sat in heavily guarded depots across Britain, a secret arsenal waiting for a crisis desperate enough to justify its use. On December 18, 1944, at SHAEF headquarters in Versailles, the air was thick with the scent of wet wool coats and stale coffee. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, his face etched with fatigue after 48 hours of non-stop crisis management, gave a curt nod to Major General Gladian M. Barnes. It wasn't a written order, but a verbal command carrying the weight of the entire Allied front. The first shipment of 15,000 Mark 32 VT fuzzes was authorized for immediate release from the heavily guarded depot near Cherbourg, France. The most valuable secret of the war was about to be risked. At the German High Command's headquarters in Zossen, the atmosphere was one of grim confidence. General Feldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel reviewed the casualty reports from the 6th Panzer Army on December 19th, the smell of his cheap cigars filling the concrete bunker. He and General Oberst Alfred Jodl attributed the initial heavy fighting to expected American stubbornness, not superior technology. They were utterly convinced their 150 new Tiger II tanks were invincible. Meanwhile, SS Brigade Führer Walter Schellenberg's intelligence analysts were poring over captured radio traffic, searching for evidence of compromised Enigma codes, completely oblivious to the technological revolution being uncrated just 300 miles away. Their focus was entirely on the wrong threat. On the frozen ground near Elsenborn Ridge, the ignorance was absolute and lethal. At 11:20 on December 20th, 1944, Lieutenant Klaus Richter, a forward spotter for the 277th Volksgrenadier Division, peered through his high-powered Scharenfernrohr 14Z periscope. He watched an American M7 Priest battery fire, a single ranging shot that buried itself in the snow 200 meters short, with a dull thump. Richter, a former mathematics student from Munich, confidently radioed the coordinates for counter-battery fire. Before his own guns could respond, the next American volley didn't land. It detonated 70 feet in the air. A series of 12 perfectly synchronized black puffs appeared out of the blizzard, unleashing a storm of steel that shredded the tree line and his men. The sound was a terrifying, sharp crack that echoed through the forest, followed instantly by screams. He had no way to explain how they'd achieved perfect airbursts in zero visibility. From the American lines, Captain Joseph Morelli of the 2nd Infantry Division watched the devastation through his M13 binoculars, a grim satisfaction cutting through the biting cold. A 1941 Harvard history graduate, Morelli understood the significance of this moment. His crew, using the new M18 fire direction computer, had just fired a time-on-target barrage of 24 shells in under 30 seconds. The POZIT fuzzes, their tiny 180 to 220 megahertz oscillators humming to life in their brief, violent flight, had turned his howitzers into weapons of unprecedented lethality. The German response was a cascade of confusion. An after-action report filed on December 21st by Oberst Wilhelm Wiebig of the 277th Division attributed the horrific losses to a new American high-explosive compound of unprecedented power. His report, sent up the chain to General der Panzertruppe Hasso von Manteuffel's headquarters, never mentioned airbursts, because the few dazed survivors couldn't articulate what had happened. This flawed analysis was exactly what Colonel David Sterling's Operation WWII disinformation campaign had been designed to produce. German scientists, like Professor Rudolf Myhler, were still chasing the ghost of a meteorological breakthrough, a fiction that was now costing them entire battalions. For the German foot soldier, the experience was pure supernatural terror. Private Hans Schmidt, a 19-year-old conscript with the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, was digging a foxhole near Bastogne on Christmas Eve 1944. The distant thunder of American 105mm guns was familiar, but what followed was not. Instead of the normal rising whistle of incoming shells, There was only an eerie 45-second silence. Then, the sky above his 150-man company simply erupted in a series of deafening cracks, like the sky itself was ripping apart. A hurricane of red-hot shrapnel scythed through the tall pines, turning his unit into a charnel house. The air filled with the coppery smell of blood and the acrid bite of cordite. There were no craters, no warning, just death from a gray, unforgiving sky. He and the 20 other survivors broke and fled. This terrifying effect was brutally efficient. A single battery of 12 M7 priests, like those supporting the 7th Armored Division, could execute a time-on-target mission, firing over 1,000 VT fuzzed shells in less than 5 minutes. This saturated a 500 by 500 meter grid with a lethal steel rain, creating a kill zone where survival was statistically impossible for troops caught in the open. Post-battle analysis by U.S. Army statisticians later estimated that the casualty rate for German infantry in the Ardennes jumped by over 300% after the fuse's introduction on December 20th. German signals intelligence, meanwhile, was chasing phantoms. At a listening post near St. Vith on December 26th, Funker Eric Weber, a 22-year-old radio hobbyist before the war, logged strange, intermittent pulses in the 200 MHz band. He noted in his logbook at 14:10 that the signals appeared just seconds before American artillery strikes landed. His superior, Hauptmann Gunther Hess, a career officer who distrusted technicians, dismissed the findings as interference from the new American -300 Seychelles rupees walkie-talkies. The idea that the shells themselves were broadcasting was so technologically inconceivable that Weber's report was filed away and forgotten, a critical clue lost to institutional arrogance. Even when they held the secret in their hands, they couldn't see it. On December 28, 1944, a patrol from the 9th SS Panzer Division found an unexploded 105 mm shell near Mannheim and rushed it to a field ordnance lab. There, Hauptsturmführer Dr. Erich Kress, a physicist who had worked under Werner Heisenberg, carefully disassembled the fuzz. He saw the 4 delicate T3 vacuum tubes and the shattered glass ampule from the wet cell battery. His final report, filed on January 2, 1945, concluded it was an overly complex barometric fuse for anti-aircraft use and that its ground burst failure rate was likely enormous. He completely missed the function of the tiny antenna ring, dismissing the Doppler radar circuit as a needlessly complicated trigger, a catastrophic failure of imagination. The operational contrast was staggering. Lieutenant Colonel Paul G. Govan of the 9th Armored Division's artillery recorded that on December 23rd, his battalion expended over 1,500 rounds of conventional ammunition to halt a single German infantry assault. Just 3 days later, on December 26th, his gunners used only 400 rounds of POZIT, fuzzed ammunition, to completely annihilate a similar-sized attack by the elite Panzer Lehr Division, inflicting an estimated 250 casualties in less than 10 minutes. This inexplicable lethality began to corrode the confidence of the German command. General Hasse von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, was a brilliant tactician whose offensive was built on speed. By December 27th, his spearheads were stalled. In a secure call to General Feldmarschall von Rundstedt's command post, his voice crackled with frustration as he reported that his infantry support was melting away under artillery of an accuracy I cannot explain. He blamed a new American system of forward observers, never once suspecting that the shells themselves were doing the aiming. The American artillerymen, however, knew exactly what they had. Sergeant Frank Miller, a 28-year-old radio repairman from Dayton, Ohio, now serving with the 101st Airborne's artillery near Bastogne, felt an almost religious awe for the new fuzzes. His pre-dawn routine involved carefully uncrating the devices, their metal casings cold and smooth in the frigid air, and screwing them onto the 105 mm shells. His crew didn't need to see the target. They just needed coordinates from a forward observer. They'd fire a volley into a patch of fog-shrouded forest, and 40 seconds later, the SCR-300 radio would crackle to life. Splash! Good effect on target. The whole damn forest just lit up. Send another 10 rounds for good measure. It was a detached, almost godlike power. Even the once invincible German tank crews began to feel a new kind of dread. While the fuse's shrapnel couldn't penetrate the thick top armor of a Tiger II tank, the perfectly timed airbursts would shred its external machine guns, shatter its delicate periscopes, and, most importantly, annihilate the supporting grenadiers who were essential for protecting the panzers from American bazooka teams in the dense woods. By early January 1945, a new term entered the German lexicon, Stahlschauer asterisk, or steel rain, a terrifying, inexplicable phenomenon that stripped their armored spearheads of their infantry shields. The German Luftwaffe was just as bewildered. On the few days the weather cleared, pilots like Oberleutnant Kurt Bullingen of Jagdgeschwader II scrambled to attack American positions. They were met with anti-aircraft fire that was unnervingly accurate. Bullingen reported seeing American 90mm shells detonate in perfectly spaced clouds of black smoke that seemed to anticipate his Focke-Wulf 190's evasive maneuvers at over 400 miles per hour. The Luftwaffe High Command attributed this to a miraculous new radar-guided gun-laying system, never imagining the shells themselves contained the radar. The Fuzz was performing its original anti-aircraft mission just as flawlessly over Belgium as it had over the Pacific. Ultimately, the German Ardennes offensive was broken by a weapon its creators never saw, heard, or understood. Their entire doctrine was predicated on the belief that artillery was an inaccurate suppression weapon. By the time the battle ended in late January 1945, German intelligence had collected dozens of dud fuzzes and hundreds of first-hand accounts of the magic shells. Yet, as post-war interviews with captured scientists like Manfred von Ardenne confirmed, they never solved the puzzle. The radio signals were dismissed as interference, the salvaged components were misidentified, and the devastating results were blamed on everything except the unbelievable truth that every American shell screaming towards them had its own tiny electronic brain. The immediate aftermath of the Ardennes was a revelation. General George S. Patton, a man not easily impressed by new gadgets, witnessed the Fuzz's effect on January 15, 1945, and immediately wrote to the War Department, declaring it the most important innovation in artillery since the invention of gunpowder. In his Washington office, the air thick with the scent of his ever-present pipe tobacco, Major General Gladian M. Barnes used Patton's glowing report to secure authorization from General George C. Marshall to increase production. The order, issued on January 22, 1945, called for an additional 2 million units per month from the Naval Ordnance Plant in Indianapolis, turning a desperate tactical gamble into the new, devastating standard for every U.S. artillery battalion in Europe. This industrial ramp-up was a logistical miracle orchestrated by the plant's director, Commander J.A. O'Brien, a tireless administrator who had overseen the hiring of over 15,000 workers by February 1945. The constant high-pitched whine of vacuum tube testing filled the 1.2 million square foot facility 24 hours a day. Meanwhile, back at the Applied Physics Laboratory, Dr. James Van Allen's team was already perfecting the Mark 45 Fuzz, a model specifically for the Army's 155mm long-tom guns. This new version featured a more advanced 5-tube amplifier circuit, making its Doppler radar more sensitive and virtually immune to electronic countermeasures, a threat that Colonel David Sterling's intelligence analysts, including Captain Frank Russo, confirmed the Germans still had no capability to even attempt. The innovation wasn't just about winning the current battle, it was about staying 2 years ahead of an enemy who didn't even know the race had started. With the Fuse now a standard-issue munition, Colonel Sterling's CIC teams faced a new, harrowing mission, denial through recovery. A directive issued from SHAEFG-2 on January 5, 1945, ordered that after every major barrage using the new shells, specially trained two-man CIC teams were to advance with the infantry to locate and destroy any duds. Near the Siegfried Line on February 11, 1945, Sergeant Mike Kowalski and his partner, Lieutenant Peter Chen, crawled for 200 yards under withering MG-42 fire to retrieve a single, mud-caked 105mm shell. The cold, smooth feel of its steel casing was a terrifying prize. They managed to unscrew the Mark 32 fuzz and smash its delicate electronics with a rifle butt just moments before a German patrol swept the area, preserving the secret at the cost of 2 other American lives lost in the covering fire. The strategic payoff for such risks was immense. During Operation Plunder, the Allied crossing of the Rhine on March 23, 1945, General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group faced hundreds of entrenched German 88mm guns. In a massive preliminary bombardment lasting over 2 hours, more than 500 American artillery pieces fired a rolling barrage of over 65,000 VT fuzzed shells. The result was a steel ceiling of perfectly timed airbursts that systematically silenced the German positions. For the engineers of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion crossing the river in flimsy assault boats, the sound wasn't of individual explosions, but a continuous, deafening roar of shredding metal, a protective canopy of death that saved an estimated 3,000 Allied lives during the initial crossing alone. Back in Maryland, Dr. Merle Tuve and his team at Section T never stopped innovating. By March 1945, Tuve, a man who seemed to subsist entirely on Chesterfield cigarettes and black coffee, had tasked his brilliant deputy, Dr. Lawrence Hafstad, with a new challenge codenamed Little Joe, creating a proximity fuzz for the 81mm mortar. This was a far greater technical hurdle, as the mortar shell's low muzzle velocity of just 700 feet per second and its unstable, wobbling flight path produced a spin rate of only 12,000 revolutions per minute, far too low for the existing fuse's safety mechanisms. Hafstad's team of 40 physicists worked for over 1,000 hours, developing a more sensitive oscillator and a new chemical delay arming switch that would make the Fuzz live only after it had traveled a safe 100 yards from the mortar tube. The constant hum of test centrifuges and oscilloscopes was the sound of a secret evolving faster than the war itself. The German High Command, meanwhile, was chasing ghosts, their confusion compounded by the very disinformation Colonel Sterling had seeded a year earlier. A captured intelligence summary from the Reich Research Council, dated February 15, 1945, and signed by the esteemed physicist Professor Rudolf Myhler, reached a fatally flawed conclusion. After analyzing dozens of battlefield reports from the Ardennes and the Ruhr River, Myhler and his colleague Manfred von Ardennes theorized that the Americans had deployed a vast network of forward observers equipped with a revolutionary infrared rangefinder, allowing for impossibly accurate fire control. The report, smelling faintly of mimeograph ink and desperation, allocated an additional 50 million Reichsmarks for a crash program to develop a competing German system, sending their best minds on a wild goose chase until the very end of the war. The tactical advantages were now statistically undeniable. A comprehensive after-action report compiled by U.S. Army Ordnance on April 20, 1945, revealed the staggering efficiency of the POZIT fuse. In the final push across Germany, divisions fully supplied with VT ammunition, like the 9th Armored, suffered 50% fewer casualties from German counter-battery fire. The average number of shells required to neutralize an enemy gun emplacement had fallen from 198 in late 1944 to just 25 by April 1945. This efficiency saved not only an estimated 1.5 million shells, but more importantly, the lives of at least 7,000 American artillerymen who were no longer exposed during prolonged fire missions. This secret's evolution continued to pay dividends in the Pacific, where its original purpose was put to the ultimate test. Commander Deke Parsons, before taking on his historic role with the Manhattan Project, had personally overseen the fleet-wide deployment of the new Mark 53 Fuzz for the Navy's 5-inch/38 caliber guns. This model featured a Doppler circuit specifically tuned by engineers at Sylvania to detect the high 350 mph closing speeds of Japanese kamikaze aircraft. During the brutal Battle of Okinawa on April 6, 1945, the destroyer USS Laffey was attacked by 22 separate aircraft. Using over 200 rounds of Mark 53 ammunition, her gunners shot down 9 kamikazes in just over 80 minutes, a defensive feat that would have been statistically impossible a year earlier. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning Japanese planes and cordite, a testament to a secret born for the sea. In less than 3 years, Project POZIT had evolved from a fragile prototype in Dr. Tuve's lab into a robust, mass-produced weapon that defined Allied technological superiority. Major General Barnes's Ordnance Command, working with private firms like the Crosley Corporation, had created a supply chain so efficient that by VE Day on May 8, 1945, over 22 million fuzzes of all types had been produced and shipped. The secret was no longer just a piece of hardware, it was a vast, invisible ecosystem of science, industry, and security. It was the physical manifestation of the vision of OSRD director, Dr. Vannevar Bush, a quiet intellectual weapon that had become as important to victory as the Sherman tank or the P-51 Mustang, a fact known only to the 500 men who held the complete picture. As the war in Europe drew to a close in May 1945, Allied intelligence teams, including Colonel Sterling's CIC units, began interrogating thousands of captured German scientists and high-ranking officers. At a detention center in Heidelberg, Dr. Erich Kress, the same physicist who had misidentified a captured fuzz in December, was questioned for 3 days by a team led by Captain Frank Russo. When shown a fully functional Mark 32 fuzz, Kress still insisted it was a flawed anti-aircraft device. He, along with every other German expert, had failed to grasp the truth. The secret had held. It had shaped the final battles, saved tens of thousands of lives, and remained completely, devastatingly invisible to its victims. The silence of the post-war years was finally broken by the rustle of aging paper. On June 11, 1961, at precisely 14:45 Eastern Standard Time, in the climate-controlled quiet of the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, Dr. Alistair Finch felt the past shift beneath his fingers. A senior military historian from Georgetown University, Finch, his eyes magnified by thick spectacles, was examining a newly declassified OSRD document. He ran a hand over the cover, Summary Technical Report, Division 4, Volume 1, The Proximity Fuze. The air smelled of old binding and floor wax. As he turned to a page detailing casualty statistics for the 277th Volksgrenadier Division in late December 1944, a quiet gasp escaped his lips. He was holding the answer to a 17-year-old mystery. The full story didn't emerge all at once. It was a slow, bureaucratic striptease that had begun years earlier. The first hint came in 1946, buried within Dr. James Finney Baxter III's Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Scientists Against Time. Baxter, the official OSRD historian, spoke of a revolutionary fuzz in vague, reverent tones. But the core technical details, the Mark 32 model's miniature 180 to 220 MHz Doppler radar, the T3 ruggedized vacuum tubes, remained sealed under the National Security Act of 1947. For over 15 years, historians like Dr. Stephen E. Ambrose were forced to speculate, piecing together rumors and redacted naval reports, frustrated by a secret the government still wasn't ready to fully reveal. The OSRD report, file number OSRDTR 1138, was the key that unlocked everything. In its 300 pages, Dr. Alistair Finch found not just the circuit diagrams drawn by Dr. James Van Allen's team, but the frantic, top-secret memos that changed the course of the war. He saw a copy of Major General Gladian M. Barnes's urgent request to General Eisenhower, dated December 18, 1944, pleading for authorization to use the 15,000 fuzzes already in France. He then saw the after-action reports from the 2nd Infantry Division's artillery near Elsenborn Ridge. On December 20th, they fired their first POZIT shells. By December 27th, German casualty reports from that sector showed a staggering 300% increase. The connection was undeniable, a devastating truth hidden in plain sight. Finch's initial findings, published in the fall 1962 issue of the * Journal of Military History, were met with a wall of academic skepticism. The established narrative, championed by esteemed historians like Professor Gordon A. Craig of Princeton University, centered on the heroism of the 101st Airborne and the timely arrival of General George S. Patton's Third Army. The idea that a 5-pound electronic gadget had been the decisive factor seemed almost insulting. It would take another 2 years of painstaking research, cross-referencing declassified German intelligence files from the Bundesarchiv Militararchiv in Freiburg, before the historical community began to accept the unbelievable truth. The most profound confirmation, however, came from the enemy themselves. In 1965, as part of an oral history project for the U.S. Army Center of Military History, Major Saul K. Padover interviewed the former commander of the 5th Panzer Army, General Hasso von Manteuffel, in his quiet home near Munich. The old general, his voice still carrying a hint of military precision, described the American artillery in the Ardennes as a frightening, supernatural force. He spoke of entire infantry companies vanishing in a steel rain that left no craters. When Padover finally explained the proximity fuse, showing him a declassified diagram, Manteuffel fell silent for nearly a minute, the only sound the ticking of a grandfather clock. "We never imagined it," he finally whispered. "We were certain it was impossible." For the American veterans who had lived through that frozen hell, the revelation, trickling down through articles in *Life 9 magazine and the Times VFW magazine * in the mid-1960s, brought a complex wave of emotions. Sergeant Frank Miller, the former artilleryman from Dayton, Ohio, was now a 50-year-old plant manager for Frigidaire. Reading a 1966 article titled "The Secret Weapon That Won the Bulge," he finally understood the almost divine power his crew had wielded near Bastogne. He remembered the cold, smooth feel of the Mark 32 fuzzes in the pre-dawn chill and the detached efficiency of firing into a fog-shrouded forest, only to hear the -300 Seychelles rupees radio crackle with reports of total annihilation. It wasn't just good aim or luck. It was a miracle of science that he, a humble radio repairman, had been a part of without ever knowing its name. By the early 1970s, the historical narrative had been irrevocably altered. The proximity Fuze was no longer a footnote but a central pillar of the Allied victory in the Ardennes. Influential historians like Stephen E. Ambrose and Charles B. MacDonald heavily featured the Fuze's impact in their seminal works. The U.S. Army's official history of the Battle of the Bulge, first published in 1965, was substantially revised for its 1972 edition, adding 2 new chapters dedicated entirely to the development, deployment, and decisive tactical effect of Project POZIT, forever changing the official story of the war's greatest land battle. The declassification also cast a long-overdue spotlight on the quiet geniuses of Section T. In 1977, the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory held a 35th anniversary symposium to honor the project. A frail but still brilliant Dr. James Van Allen, now world-famous for discovering Earth's radiation belts, delivered the keynote address. He described the frantic, 1,000-hour workweeks and the constant smell of ozone and hot electronics in the lab at 8621 Georgia Avenue. Holding up a gleaming deactivated Mark 32 fuzz for the audience of over 50 surviving project veterans, he called it the, quote, direct ancestor of every smart weapon on Earth, and the applause lasted for nearly 2 solid minutes. The final pieces of the puzzle fell into place in 1985, with the declassification of the counterintelligence core files under designation RG-319. These documents, smelling faintly of dust and time, revealed the breathtaking scope of the secrecy. They detailed Operation WWII, the brilliant disinformation campaign masterminded by Colonel David Stirling that sent Germany's top scientists, including Professor Rudolf Myhler, searching for a non-existent meteorological device for over 18 months. The files contained the post-war interrogation of Hauptsturmführer Dr. Erich Kress, the physicist who had examined a dud fuzz and dismissed it, his pride blinding him to the impossible truth. The deception had been as perfect as the technology it protected. The revelation was now complete. The Battle of the Bulge was no longer a simple story of heroic defense. It was now understood as a complex modern battle, a turning point, where a hidden technological marvel, forged 2 years earlier in a quiet Maryland laboratory by men like Dr. Merle Tuve and Commander Deke Parsons, was unleashed at the moment of maximum crisis. The victory wasn't just won in the frozen foxholes of the Ardennes. It was secured by a secret firestorm the enemy never saw, never understood, and could never have imagined. The official recognition, when it finally came, wasn't a thunderclap, but a slow dawn. The first whisper was Dr. James Finney Baxter III's 1946 book, Scientists Against Time. But the full story remained locked away. It wasn't until President Harry S. Truman quietly awarded Dr. Merle Tuve the Presidential Medal for Merit on March 27, 1948, that the project's leader was honored, though the ceremony's 15-minute duration gave no hint of the secret's true scale. The real vindication came from the quiet rustle of declassified papers in the 1960s, and the ink of historians like Stephen E. Ambrose, who rewrote the narrative of the Ardennes. By 1972, the U.S. Army's official history of the battle was revised, finally giving OSRD's Section T and its 110 scientists their rightful, decisive place in the story of a victory that had been won, in large part, by their invisible firestorm. The technological echo of Project POZIT became a deafening roar in the decades that followed. The very same year the war ended, 1945, the Applied Physics Laboratory began Project Bumblebee, using the Fuze's principles to create the RIM-2 Terrier, the U.S. Navy's first operational surface-to-air missile. The work of Commander Deke Parsons and the vision of Dr. Vannevar Bush had created a direct lineage to every smart weapon of the modern age. From the AIM-9 Sidewinder to modern smart artillery, the core concept of a rugged, self-contained targeting system remains. The final tally was staggering: over 22 million fuzzes produced at a cost of nearly $1 billion, a secret that didn't just win a battle, but permanently changed the science of warfare. The human legacy was more complex, a mixture of delayed pride and the quiet weight of a secret kept too long. It wasn't until August 12, 1992, on the 50th anniversary of the first successful test, that a plaque was dedicated at the old Naval Ordnance Plant in Indianapolis, honoring the 15,000 workers, most of whom went to their graves believing they had merely assembled radio parts for the Crosley Corporation. This honor extended to the ghosts of the CIC, men like Sergeant Mike Kowalski, whose recovery of a dud fuzz on February 11, 1945, remained a classified act of heroism for 40 years. For the architects of the secret, there was a different kind of burden. Colonel David Stirling lived until 1988, knowing his brilliant deception had sent Professor Rudolf Myhler on an 18-month wild goose chase, a necessary lie that nevertheless cost lives on both sides. For the veterans, the revelation brought a strange, cold clarity, the memory of the bitter Belgian air finally connected to the scientific miracle they'd unknowingly unleashed. Today, the physical remnants of that miracle are scattered but preserved. The nondescript brick building at 8621 Georgia Avenue, where Dr. Tuve's team wrestled with physics, now houses commercial offices, but a small, unassuming plaque marks it as the birthplace of the smart weapon. In the now silent forests of the Ardennes, Memorials to the 101st Airborne and 2nd Infantry Division now include text crediting the variable time Fuze for their improbable survival. The curriculum at West Point, where Major General Gladian M. Barnes graduated in 1910, was permanently altered. After 1972, any study of the Ardennes offensive required a full chapter on the fuzz, a lesson in technological surprise for every future officer. And in the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, under the soft gleam of gallery lights, sits a cutaway Mark 32, its 4 delicate T3 vacuum tubes forever silent. In that museum, under protective glass, the 5-pound secret rests. It looks deceptively simple, a relic of a bygone analog age. But within its cold steel casing lies the answer to a 17-year-old mystery, the brain behind the firestorm that saved an estimated 7,000 American lives. It is more than a weapon. It is a monument to a moment when a handful of scientists, working in absolute secrecy, built a ghost in a machine that turned the tide of the war's greatest battle. A silent testament that sometimes the most decisive weapon is the one the enemy never even knew existed,